The camera lights flared, the studio floor humming with that electric tension only live television can hold. Across the glossy news desk sat Alan Dershowitz, famed Harvard professor, sharp-tongued, unfiltered. He leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, the one that said he'd seen it all. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, composed, focused, her notes neatly stacked in front of her. The host introduced the segment. Tonight, we ask, has Congress lost its constitutional compass? Before the question even finished, Dershowitz cut in. Well, with all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett represents exactly what's wrong with today's politics. Too emotional, not enough understanding of the law. The words hit the air like a spark in dry grass. The studio fell silent for half a second. Then murmurs rippled through the audience. Jasmine's eyes didn't flinch. Her lips curved into the faintest knowing smile. She could have interrupted. She could have snapped back. But instead, she waited. And that stillness was louder than any outburst. Dershowitz continued, his tone dripping with the confidence of a man used to winning. I've spent 50 years teaching constitutional law. I know the difference between rhetoric and reason. The host tried to step in, but Jasmine's voice, steady, calm, cut through. And I've spent my life fighting for people who've been silenced by that very kind of arrogance. The room froze. Her tone wasn't loud. It was surgical, the kind that doesn't aim to hurt, but to reveal. Dershowitz blinked, surprised by the precision. The audience leaned forward, sensing something was about to shift. Jasmine continued. You say you know the law, Professor, but maybe what this country needs right now isn't another lecture. It's accountability. The host's eyes widened. Dershowitz tilted his head, caught between disbelief and discomfort. And then, with perfect calm, Jasmine added, So if we're going to talk about the Constitution, let's start with the part that guarantees equality. For everyone, not just the ones who can afford your classroom. The audience erupted. Cameras zoomed in. Dershowitz's smirk faltered for the first time. And just like that, the balance of power in the room shifted. But what Jasmine said next would make even Alan Dershowitz question his own words. The segment wasn't supposed to go viral. It was meant to be another evening of sharp exchanges and safe sound bites. But after Jasmine Crockett's first rebuttal, the energy inside that studio changed. You could feel it, like static before a lightning strike. Producers in the control room leaned closer to their monitors. One whispered, "Did she just challenge Dershowitz on his own field?" Another replied, "If she keeps going like this, we've got a headline." On screen, the host tried to regain control. "All right, let's keep this civil," he said, forcing a smile. "Congresswoman Crockett, Professor Dershowitz, our viewers want clarity, not conflict." But clarity was never the issue. Respect was. Dershowitz adjusted his tie, pretending to laugh it off. "Oh, I enjoy spirited debate. It's just, well, when you deal with emotion rather than evidence, the conversation can get derailed." The word emotion hung in the air like a thin insult. Everyone knew what he meant. It wasn't about feelings. It was about undermining her intellect. The condescension wasn't new to Jasmine. She'd seen it in courtrooms, in committee hearings, in every space where women who looked like her were expected to listen, not lead. She leaned slightly forward, her voice even. "Professor, you talk about evidence, but you conveniently forget that evidence doesn't mean much if those in power refuse to see it." The host sensed tension building, but couldn't interrupt the gravity of the moment. Jasmine continued, each word deliberate. Every time a woman of color speaks up, she's labeled emotional. But when a man raises his voice, he's called passionate. Isn't that the real imbalance of our so-called constitutional debate? The audience murmured again. One cameraman whispered, "She's turning this into something bigger." And she was, because this wasn't just a disagreement about the Constitution anymore. It was a clash about who gets to define expertise in America. Online, the ripple was already beginning. Clips of the exchange were spreading across social media. Viewers were cutting the moment when Dershowitz smirked and overlaying Jasmine's words like a rallying cry. Tweets poured in. Crockett just schooled Dershowitz with calm fire. She's teaching the teacher. Finally, someone calling out intellectual gaslighting live. Inside the studio, Dershowitz tried to regain footing. He spoke over her again, his tone sharp. "Congresswoman, you're confusing legal precedent with political posturing. There's a reason people study constitutional law for decades before—" Jasmine interrupted softly. "You mean the same decades where laws were written to silence the very people I represent?" That line cut deeper than any shout could. The audience gasped. Dershowitz blinked, thrown off balance. For the first time, his rhythm broke. He tried to laugh, but the humor fell flat. The host looked helplessly between them, sensing this had gone far beyond TV theater, and that's when it became clear. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about power. Alan Dershowitz, the man who had lectured presidents and argued before the Supreme Court, had underestimated the Congresswoman sitting across from him. He thought he'd corner her with pedigree and prestige. But Jasmine Crockett was about to show him something he hadn't seen in years, a mind as sharp as his. Guided by a truth far deeper than ego, what came next wouldn't just change the tone of the interview. It would change how millions viewed the meaning of expertise itself, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't done yet. She was just getting started before the clash that would light up every political feed in America. Alan Dershowitz had built an empire of intellect and infamy. He wasn't just a scholar. He was a legend in his own mind. The man who had defended presidents, debated the Supreme Court, and lectured on the Constitution as if he'd personally signed it. From the very start of his career, Dershowitz learned one thing: power respected audacity. As a young Harvard professor, he wasn't afraid to take on controversial clients or controversial cases. He relished the attention. Every headline, every gasp in a courtroom was fuel, and over the years, that habit turned into a persona. By the time the TV lights hit him that night opposite Jasmine Crockett, he wasn't there to debate. He was there to dominate. To him, debate was performance, a courtroom without walls. He loved the camera, the confrontation, the intellectual theater of it all. And in his world, the one with the sharper tongue always won. But there was something he didn't understand. The world had changed. This wasn't the Harvard lecture hall of the 1980s. This was a new America, one that didn't bow to polished arrogance. A generation that had learned to question expertise when it came wrapped in condescension. And across from him sat a woman who embodied that shift, Jasmine Crockett. While Dershowitz's confidence was born in ivory towers, Crockett's came from the courtroom trenches. She'd fought for justice where the law wasn't theoretical, where people's lives were on the line. She'd seen firsthand how the system favored those who could afford lawyers like Dershowitz. So when he smirked that night, she didn't just see an opponent. She saw everything wrong with the way power had been wielded in America's name. In the green room before the show, Dershowitz had made small talk, sipping black coffee with the assuredness of a man who had been called a genius so many times he believed it was his birthright. "I hear Congresswoman Crockett's quite passionate," he'd said to the producer. "Let's hope she remembers this isn't a protest rally." The producer laughed nervously. But that one offhand remark would echo later, when passionate became the word that turned the internet against him. When the camera started rolling, Dershowitz was in his element. Every gesture rehearsed, every glance calculated. He led with complex legal jargon, throwing around terms like originalist interpretation and judicial restraint, fully expecting to leave Crockett cornered in semantics. But Crockett didn't take the bait. Instead of reacting, she listened, calmly, intently, and when her turn came, she dismantled his argument not with anger, but with precision. "Professor," she said, voice measured, "you speak of judicial restraint as if it's some kind of moral high ground. But let's be honest, restraint for whom? Because when the court restrains progress, the people who pay the price aren't sitting in your lecture halls." That's when the shift began. For the first time, Dershowitz's rhythm broke. He was used to opponents trying to outshout him, not outthink him. Crockett's composure unnerved him. Every rebuttal she gave wasn't just an argument, it was a mirror, reflecting his own hypocrisy back at him. You could see it on his face, the twitch of irritation, the faint blush of embarrassment. He tried humor. "Well, Congresswoman, that's a rather emotional take." And that's when she cut in. "No, Professor, that's a factual take. It just happens to make you uncomfortable." The audience gasped. The host froze. And Dershowitz, the man who'd silenced senators and presidents, was, for a brief second, speechless. Behind that silence, though, was something darker. Wounded pride. He'd spent his life teaching others how to win with words. But now he was losing to a woman half his age, live on national television, and that humiliation would sting far beyond the studio lights. Because after that night, the headlines wouldn't read "Dershowitz dominates debate." They'd read, "Jasmine Crockett outsmarts legal giant on live TV. Dershowitz's arrogance meets its match." Crockett redefines what power looks like. The man who once thought he could talk circles around anyone had finally met someone who didn't play in circles at all. She spoke in straight lines, cutting through every layer of pretense. And as the clip spread online, Dershowitz's reputation began to fracture in real time. The old guard of pundits tried to defend him, but the new generation wasn't buying it. They'd seen what happened, they'd seen him talk down, and they'd seen her rise up. For Alan Dershowitz, this wasn't just a loss. It was the moment his brand of intellect, cold, elitist, untouchable, started to feel outdated. And for Jasmine Crockett, it was something far greater. It was the moment she proved that respect isn't earned by age or title. It's earned by truth. The debate had been tense from the start, but now the air inside the studio was electric. Viewers at home could feel it through the screen. The host had long stopped trying to mediate. This was no longer a discussion. It was a showdown. Alan Dershowitz leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his glasses, the faintest smile playing across his lips. He had found what he thought was Crockett's weakness. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you keep talking about fairness and justice as though they're feelings. The law isn't about how people feel. It's about precedent. You don't rewrite the Constitution every time someone gets emotional about a ruling they don't like." The studio audience gave a polite murmur, half nervous, half intrigued. Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, eyes steady, like she'd been waiting for that line all along. Then she smiled. "Professor," she said calmly, "you keep calling justice an emotion. Maybe that's why so many of your students learn to argue but not to listen." The crowd's reaction was instant. Laughter, applause, a few gasps. But Crockett wasn't done. She wasn't going for sound bites. She was going for truth. "You sit there quoting precedent," she continued, "as though every precedent was born perfect. But let's talk about what precedent actually meant in this country, shall we? Precedent said women couldn't vote. Precedent said my ancestors could be owned. Precedent said segregation was lawful order. So forgive me if I don't worship the word like it's holy. The law isn't sacred, Professor. People are." For the first time, Dershowitz's smirk faded. The audience had shifted, away from him, toward her. Even the camera operators could feel it. The lens slowly pushed in on Crockett's face, catching the conviction burning behind her calm. Dershowitz tried to recover, cutting in mid-sentence. "That's a gross oversimplification." Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "No, Professor. What's gross is pretending those mistakes weren't made by men who thought exactly like you. Brilliant, confident, and absolutely certain they couldn't be wrong." That line landed like a hammer. The host tried to interject, but it was too late. The moment had taken over. The audience broke into applause that drowned out the next few seconds of broadcast. Even those who didn't know Crockett before were now leaning forward, captivated. And Crockett pressed on, voice steady as ever. "You say I'm emotional. I say I'm human. You say the law doesn't change. I say it must, because when the world evolves, justice has to evolve with it. Otherwise, we're just dressing up oppression in a three-piece suit." That last sentence hung in the air. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the room. Dershowitz opened his mouth, then stopped. For a man who prided himself on always having a rebuttal, the words simply wouldn't come. His silence said more than any argument could. The host turned, almost uncertain how to proceed. "Professor Dershowitz, would you like to respond?" He hesitated, the cameras catching every flicker of discomfort. "Well, I suppose Congresswoman Crockett makes some passionate points," he stammered, trying to force a chuckle. Crockett didn't even look at him this time. She turned to the camera, addressing not her opponent, but the people watching at home. "And that right there," she said softly, "is why these conversations matter. Because the people who've had power for so long think passion is a weakness. But it's not. It's the heartbeat of every movement that's ever made this country better." Her tone wasn't angry. It was proud, resolute, and that made it hit even harder. Dershowitz finally exhaled, adjusting his tie, clearly rattled. The host, sensing the shift, wrapped the segment. "We'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for—" But before he could finish, Crockett turned back one last time. "Oh, and Professor," she said with a small grin, "the next time you call someone emotional, make sure it's not because they're reminding you what justice actually looks like." The audience erupted. Even those who'd come into the studio expecting Dershowitz to dominate were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling. It was the sound of a power dynamic flipping in real time. The old guard humbled by the new. And Dershowitz? He just sat there, eyes down for a moment, then forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. For years, he'd taught others how to control a narrative. But that night, Jasmine Crockett rewrote the story in front of him. Live, unedited, unstoppable. The clip would go viral within hours. The hashtags would trend. But more than that, something deeper happened. People saw a black woman refuse to be talked down to by a man who'd built a career talking over everyone else. They saw intellect and empathy stand toe-to-toe with arrogance and win. And somewhere in that studio, under the glare of those lights, Alan Dershowitz finally learned what every great debater eventually does. Sometimes, brilliance isn't about who talks louder. It's about who tells the truth louder. By the next morning, the internet was on fire. The clip of Jasmine Crockett calmly dismantling Alan Dershowitz wasn't just circulating, it was everywhere. On X, someone captioned it, "The moment arrogance met education." On TikTok, edits layered her final line, "Make sure it's not because they're reminding you what justice looks like," over slow-motion close-ups and thunderous applause. Hashtags like Nunder Crockett Clapback, nommed truth over titles, and Unbothered Queen shot up the charts. Even mainstream anchors couldn't ignore it. Morning panels replayed the exchange, frame by frame, as pundits dissected how a freshman congresswoman had out-argued one of the most seasoned legal minds in America. Some conservatives tried to spin it. "She was disrespectful," one commentator huffed on cable. But the clip spoke louder than any spin. Her tone had been calm, her reasoning airtight, her dignity unshakable. The more they criticized, the more people shared it. By afternoon, reaction videos were flooding YouTube. One law student grinned into the camera. "That's how you cross-examine ego." Another, a middle-aged black woman, wiped away tears and whispered, "Finally, someone who looks like me stood her ground and didn't flinch." The energy wasn't just digital, it was emotional. Viewers felt seen. Crockett hadn't shouted. She hadn't stormed off. She had simply told the truth and refused to shrink, and that struck a chord across generations. Even in Washington's marble corridors, the shift was palpable. Staffers replayed the clip in offices. Journalists hovered in hallways, whispering about whether Dershowitz would respond. He didn't. Instead, his team quietly canceled a scheduled TV appearance that week. Meanwhile, Crockett kept moving, unfazed. When reporters cornered her outside the Capitol, microphones flashing, she smiled and said only, "Accountability isn't arrogance, it's patriotism." That one sentence became its own headline. Late that night, under the glow of millions of screens, a wave of support rose online. Artwork, remixes, and essays celebrating what she'd done. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It was a movement moment, because somewhere between Dershowitz's smirk and Crockett's calm reply, people realized something simple but profound. The future of debate in America didn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the one with the most truth behind it. And as the views passed 50 million, one caption summed it up best. He had decades of power. She had one moment of courage. Guess which one people remember? In the quiet after the storm, when the trending hashtags began to fade and the news cycle churned forward, something about Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Alan Dershowitz still lingered in the public consciousness. It wasn't just what she said, it was what she represented. Here was a congresswoman who had faced down a man with a lifetime of legal prestige and refused to bow to condescension. She didn't shout him down, she stood him down. That distinction mattered. Because in an era where chaos often drowns out conviction, Jasmine's restraint became her power. Weeks later, during a local town hall, someone in the audience asked her if she'd meant to go viral that night. She chuckled softly before replying, "No, I just meant to be honest." The fact that honesty went viral says a lot about where we are as a country. That single line drew applause, not because it was clever, but because it was true. People were tired of watching power talk over integrity, tired of seeing calm dismissed as weakness. And when Jasmine refused to match arrogance with anger, she showed that clarity could be louder than volume. Even her critics, begrudgingly, began to admit it. One columnist wrote, "You don't have to agree with her politics to see that." She exposed something uncomfortable about the way women, especially women of color, are treated in intellectual spaces. That, right there, was the legacy of the moment. It wasn't about winning an argument on live TV, it was about shifting the standard. Because real power isn't measured in how many people you can silence. It's measured in how many truths you can speak without losing yourself. Jasmine Crockett didn't just clap back. She reclaimed the narrative. She turned the image of the angry black woman inside out and replaced it with something unstoppable, the unshakable woman. And in doing so, she reminded millions watching, especially young women, students, and marginalized voices, that authority doesn't belong to those who demand respect. It belongs to those who earn it through courage, preparation, and poise under pressure. In that courtroom-like studio, where egos had tried to flex and dominance had tried to dictate, Jasmine had done the simplest, hardest thing of all. She had stayed grounded in truth. That's why her words echoed. That's why people still quoted her weeks later, because her calm was contagious and her dignity undeniable. As one fan wrote online beneath a repost of the clip, she didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard. And in a time when so many voices fight to be heard, that might just be the loudest statement of all. The days after the televised clash felt like an echo chamber of disbelief. What had begun as a tense intellectual duel now pulsed through the veins of American media, sparking something bigger, something cultural. Late-night hosts joked about it. But beneath the laughter was awe. You ever see someone dismantle a Harvard legend with a smile? One monologue quipped. Jasmine Crockett did that before the first commercial break. The audience roared. Cable networks replayed the segment in endless loops. Analysts debated not just what was said, but how it was said. The same legal scholars who once quoted Dershowitz now found themselves quoting Crockett. Her lines turned into academic sound bites. Her calm delivery dissected like a masterclass in controlled rhetoric. In classrooms, young law students watched the exchange as part of debate training. One professor paused the video midway and told his class, "That's composure under pressure. You don't have to shout to win. You just have to mean it." But outside academia, the ripple was emotional. Women, especially Black and brown women, flooded social media with messages of pride and gratitude. "She spoke for every time we were talked over," one user wrote. "For every time they thought we weren't smart enough, calm enough, or good enough." Within days, hashtags turned into movement slogans. Fan edits appeared, slow zooms, piano music, Crockett's words echoing like a promise. Clips of her final line, "It's not arrogance to demand accountability," were stitched with archival footage of civil rights leaders, creating an unspoken lineage that transcended generations. Dershowitz, meanwhile, fell quiet. For once, he didn't call into talk shows or write op-eds. He stayed off camera, a silence more telling than any rebuttal. Inside the Capitol, even colleagues who'd once dismissed Crockett as a firebrand now watched her differently. She wasn't the angry Congresswoman anymore. She was the one who stood her ground. And won. Reporters caught up with her days later as she left a committee hearing. "Congresswoman Crockett," one shouted, "how does it feel knowing millions are calling your exchange historic?" She smiled faintly, that same controlled poise radiating through the noise. "If people learned something from it," she said, "then it wasn't just a debate. It was progress." That quote, just 12 words, hit harder than any headline, because the truth was, Crockett hadn't just silenced a man. She'd awakened a conversation about power, privilege, and the poise it takes to challenge both. And in homes, classrooms, and communities across the country, the takeaway was clear. Dignity wasn't quiet. It was steady. It was unstoppable. The storm she started wasn't fading. It was spreading. And for the first time, even her critics had to admit, Alan Dershowitz hadn't lost to anger. He'd lost to grace. When the noise finally settled, when the applause had faded and the headlines moved on, what lingered wasn't the argument or even the viral clip. It was the feeling. The image of Jasmine Crockett sitting tall under the glare of those studio lights had burned itself into the national memory. Calm, composed, fearless. She hadn't needed to shout, insult, or even gloat. Her victory was quieter, the kind that speaks for itself, and yet beneath that calm, something deeper stirred. Crockett's exchange with Alan Dershowitz wasn't just a debate between two legal minds. It was a collision of eras. The old America that glorified hierarchy and intimidation, meeting the new America that demanded accountability and truth. For many, her composure became a mirror. It reflected every moment they'd been dismissed, every meeting where they'd been interrupted, every classroom where they were told to tone it down. She turned those moments of silence into power. During an interview weeks later, a journalist asked if she felt sorry for how humiliated Dershowitz looked at the end. Crockett didn't hesitate. "I don't deal in humiliation," she said softly. I deal in clarity. If truth embarrasses someone, that's not my fault. That's their reflection. Those words hit like scripture. Within hours, they were trending again. This time not as a clip of confrontation, but as a statement of identity, because Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she reframed what winning looked like. She reminded people that intellect without empathy is just ego in disguise. That real leadership doesn't need validation from the loudest man in the room. It grows from the quiet conviction to stand alone if you must. Her moment with Dershowitz became a parable for modern America. You can't shame someone who's rooted in truth. You can't intimidate someone who knows exactly why they're fighting, and maybe that's what shook people most. That unshakable stillness in her. In an age addicted to outrage, Crockett had offered something rarer, dignity, and for millions watching across the country, that was more than just refreshing. It was revolutionary, because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman sitting across from power, smiling, unbothered, and utterly certain she's right. The clip may have ended, but the message, that stayed. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge a legal titan. She reminded America that intellect isn't defined by titles, gender, or skin tone. It's defined by truth, and the courage to speak it when it's hardest to do so. That's why this moment hit deeper than a trending debate. It wasn't just a clapback, it was a reclaiming of respect, of representation, of voice. And for millions watching, it was validation that yes, calm can be powerful, and grace can be devastating. Crockett didn't need to destroy her opponent. She dismantled the hierarchy that let people like him speak over others for decades. She showed that the next generation of leadership doesn't rise by shouting louder. It rises by standing firmer. Across the country, that message sparked something electric. In classrooms, young women replayed her words. In boardrooms, quiet professionals found new confidence to speak up. And in homes, parents told their daughters, that's what strength looks like. Because this wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's win, it was a reminder to everyone who's ever been underestimated. Your calm is not weakness. Your intellect is not up for debate. And your dignity will always be louder than their disrespect. So, if you felt that, if you saw yourself in that moment when power tried to belittle truth, this is your call. Don't just watch history unfold. Be part of it. Share this story. Keep it alive. Remind every doubter, every interrupter, every voice that thought you'd stay silent, that you too can stand your ground and smile while doing it. Because as Jasmine Crockett proved that night, sometimes the sharpest weapon in the room isn't anger, it's composure. And that's exactly what changes everything.